The sharp slap of bare feet against wet tile echoed through Riverside High's empty locker room like gunshots. Emma Rodriguez stood motionless in the center of the chaos, water dripping from her dark hair onto the cold floor beneath her feet. Around her lay the scattered remains of what had been her clothes just moments before, torn fabric, mixed with the cruel laughter that still rang in her ears. But Jessica Walsh and her crew had made one catastrophic miscalculation when they decided to humiliate the quiet new girl. They had no idea that the plain black belt hanging forgotten in Emma's gym locker wasn't just any belt. It was a second-degree black belt in Shotokan karate, earned through 9 years of disciplined training under Sensei Michael Tanaka back in San Diego. They couldn't have known that those small, seemingly fragile hands had broken boards, won tournaments, and mastered techniques that could disable an opponent in seconds. Most importantly, they had no understanding that Emma Rodriguez had learned long ago that sometimes the greatest strength comes from knowing exactly when to unleash it. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Emma reached for her torn shirt with movements so controlled and precise that they seemed almost ceremonial. Her breathing remained steady, her heart rate calm, even as the reality of what had just happened settled around her like the steam from the showers. 3 girls had cornered her, stripped her, filmed her humiliation, and walked away laughing, confident they had broken another victim. Instead, they had awakened something they were utterly unprepared to face. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, Emma Rodriguez had walked through the glass doors of Riverside High School carrying nothing but a worn backpack and the weight of starting over in a new place. Millbrook, Oregon was the kind of small suburban town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where family reputations were inherited like genetic traits, and where being different was the fastest way to become invisible, or worse, a target. Emma preferred invisible. At 16, she had already learned that standing out brought unwanted attention, and unwanted attention led to complications she didn't need in her life. Her father's deployment to Afghanistan had forced her and her grandmother to relocate from San Diego to this quiet corner of the Pacific Northwest, where the cost of living was manageable on a military salary and her grandmother's Social Security. The girl who registered for classes that August morning looked like the dictionary definition of unremarkable. Standing barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, with a slight build that suggested she might blow away in a strong wind, Emma had the kind of forgettable face that teachers struggled to remember even after months of having her in class. Her long black hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, her clothes were practical rather than fashionable, and her voice rarely rose above a whisper, unless directly questioned. What made Emma truly invisible at Riverside High wasn't just her physical appearance or her quiet demeanor. It was her complete disinterest in the social hierarchies that governed teenage life. While other students navigated the complex politics of popularity, Emma ate lunch alone by choice, reading books that had nothing to do with her assignments. She walked the hallways with purpose, getting from point A to point B without lingering to gossip or socialize. She turned in her homework on time, participated just enough in class discussions to avoid unwanted attention from teachers, and generally existed in a parallel universe that rarely intersected with the drama and dynamics that consumed her classmates. This strategy had worked perfectly for 5.5 months. Emma had managed to complete almost an entire school year without making enemies, attracting bullies, or getting caught up in the kinds of conflicts that seemed to follow other students like storm clouds. She had exactly 37 days left until summer vacation, at which point she would have successfully navigated her junior year without incident. But high school social dynamics have a way of seeking out even the most determined wallflowers, and Emma's careful invisibility was about to collide head-on with Riverside High's most dangerous predator. Jessica Walsh didn't just attend Riverside High School. She ruled it with the kind of absolute authority usually reserved for medieval monarchs or corporate CEOs. At 17, she possessed the lethal combination of natural beauty, inherited wealth, and the complete absence of empathy that made her both admired and feared throughout the halls of Riverside High. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves that seemed to defy both gravity and the Oregon humidity. Her wardrobe consisted entirely of designer pieces that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month, and her smile could shift from charming to cruel in the space of a heartbeat. Jessica's power at Riverside High wasn't accidental or inherited. It was carefully constructed and ruthlessly maintained through a combination of social manipulation, strategic cruelty, and the kind of political connections that made challenging her seem not just difficult, but actively dangerous. Her mother, Patricia Walsh, sat on the school board and chaired the district's disciplinary committee. Her father owned Walsh Development, the construction company responsible for building half of Millbrook's upscale subdivisions and the largest employer in the county. Her uncle served as the town's mayor, and her family's charitable donations funded everything from the school's new computer lab to the football team's equipment. This network of influence meant that Jessica Walsh operated under different rules than ordinary students. When she was caught cheating on her SATs, the incident disappeared from her record. When she orchestrated a harassment campaign against a transfer student who had dared to try out for her spot on the cheerleading squad, the victim was transferred to another district for her own protection, while Jessica faced no consequences. When she threw a party that resulted in 3 students being hospitalized for alcohol poisoning, her parents' lawyers ensured that no charges were filed and no suspensions were issued. But Jessica's true talent wasn't in avoiding consequences. It was in identifying vulnerability and exploiting it with surgical precision. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect weakness, insecurity, or fear in other students, and she used this talent to maintain her position at the top of Riverside High's social food chain. Her victims were never chosen randomly. They were selected based on careful observation, strategic value, and most importantly, their inability to fight back effectively. For months, Jessica had been aware of Emma Rodriguez in the way that apex predators are aware of everything in their territory. But the quiet new girl had presented no threat and offered no particular strategic value. Emma didn't compete for social status, didn't challenge Jessica's authority, and didn't possess anything that Jessica wanted. In the complex ecosystem of high school politics, Emma was essentially invisible, which meant she was also essentially safe. That safety evaporated on a Tuesday morning in late February, when Emma made the mistake of being in the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. The incident began in Mrs. Patterson's advanced placement chemistry class, where Jessica Walsh was struggling with a lab assignment that would constitute 20% of her semester grade. Despite her family's influence and her carefully maintained image of effortless perfection, Jessica was not a particularly gifted student. She had reached her senior year through a combination of tutors, grade manipulation, and the kind of academic accommodations that money could buy, but advanced placement chemistry required a level of genuine understanding that couldn't be purchased or politically maneuvered. Emma Rodriguez, meanwhile, had been quietly excelling in every academic subject since her arrival at Riverside High. Her grades weren't just good, they were exceptional, the result of years of disciplined study habits instilled by her military father and reinforced by her grandmother's unwavering expectations. Chemistry, in particular, came naturally to Emma, who approached the subject with the same methodical precision she had once applied to learning kata forms in her karate training. When Mrs. Patterson announced that students could work in pairs for the complex titration lab that would determine their semester grades, Emma's first instinct was to work alone. She had partnered with other students on previous assignments and had learned that collaboration often meant doing most of the work while sharing the credit. But Mrs. Patterson had specifically mandated partnerships for this assignment, leaving Emma with no choice but to find someone to work with. The cruel mathematics of high school social dynamics meant that Emma was among the last students chosen for partnerships. She watched as friends paired off, as strategic alliances were formed, and as the popular students claimed the most academically gifted partners. When the selection process was nearly complete, Emma found herself standing near Jessica Walsh, who was surveying the remaining options with the kind of disdain usually reserved for expired milk. What happened next would be debated in the halls of Riverside High for months afterward. Some students claimed that Jessica had approached Emma and demanded to be her partner, using her typical combination of charm and implicit threat. Others insisted that Emma had volunteered to work with Jessica, either out of misguided kindness or social climbing ambition. The truth was far simpler and far more innocent than either version suggested. Mrs. Patterson, observing that her 2 remaining students had not yet formed a partnership, simply announced that Emma Rodriguez and Jessica Walsh would be working together. Neither girl had chosen the other. They had simply been the last 2 names on the roster, victims of alphabetical proximity and scheduling coincidence. For Emma, The partnership represented nothing more than an academic obligation to be completed as efficiently and professionally as possible. She approached the collaboration with the same detached competence she brought to all her schoolwork, preparing thoroughly for the lab, organizing the necessary materials, and creating a detailed timeline for completing the assignment. Jessica, however, viewed the partnership through an entirely different lens. Being randomly assigned to work with the school's invisible girl felt like a public diminishment of her status, a suggestion that she belonged in the same academic category as someone who shopped at thrift stores and ate free lunch. Worse yet, Emma's obvious competence in chemistry made Jessica acutely aware of her own academic limitations, creating the kind of vulnerability that Jessica had spent years learning to eliminate through preemptive strikes against anyone who might expose her weaknesses. The actual lab assignment proceeded without incident for the first 2 class periods. Emma handled most of the technical work, while Jessica focused on the presentation aspects that would allow her to maintain her image of effortless competence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They worked together efficiently, if not warmly, communicating only when necessary and maintaining the kind of professional distance that kept their interaction from becoming either conflict or friendship. The problem arose during the 3rd day of the lab, when Emma discovered a significant error in Jessica's calculations that would have resulted in a failing grade for both of them. The mistake was subtle but fundamental, the kind of error that revealed a basic misunderstanding of the underlying chemical principles they were supposed to be demonstrating. Emma faced a choice that would have been simple for most students, but was surprisingly complex given the social dynamics at play. She could quietly correct the error herself, allowing Jessica to maintain her illusion of competence while ensuring that their joint grade remained high. This was the safest option, the path that would avoid conflict and allow Emma to return to her preferred invisibility once the assignment was completed. Alternatively, she could point out the error to Jessica, giving her partner the opportunity to understand and correct the mistake herself. This was the academically honest approach, the choice that respected both Jessica's intelligence and the educational purpose of the assignment. Emma chose education over safety. During their next lab session, she carefully explained the error to Jessica, walking through the calculations step by step and demonstrating the correct methodology. Her tone was respectful and patient, her manner completely professional. She made no attempt to embarrass Jessica or assert intellectual superiority. She simply provided the information necessary for their mutual success. Jessica's response was immediate and devastating. Her face flushed red, her eyes narrowed, and her voice dropped to the whisper that students at Riverside High had learned to fear above all other sounds. "You think you're smarter than me," she said, not loudly enough for Mrs. Patterson to hear, but clearly enough for several nearby students to catch every word. "You think because your family can't afford decent clothes and you eat free lunch, that you need to prove how much better you are than everyone else." Emma's first instinct was to apologize, to explain that she had only been trying to help, to diffuse the situation before it escalated into something that would threaten her carefully maintained invisibility. But something in Jessica's tone, some combination of casual cruelty and absolute entitlement, triggered a response that Emma hadn't felt since leaving California. "I think I understand chemistry," Emma replied quietly, meeting Jessica's stare without flinching. "The assignment requires accuracy. I was helping us both succeed." The silence that followed could have been measured in heartbeats. Several students at nearby lab stations had stopped their work to listen, sensing the kind of confrontation that would be discussed for weeks afterward. Mrs. Patterson continued grading papers at her desk, oblivious to the tension building in her classroom. Jessica Walsh stared at Emma Rodriguez for what felt like an eternity, her mind processing the unprecedented experience of being corrected by someone she considered beneath her notice. In 17 years of life, Jessica had rarely encountered anyone willing to challenge her directly, and never from someone with so little social protection. The audacity of Emma's response was so unexpected that for a moment Jessica was actually speechless. When she finally found her voice, her words carried the kind of promise that made students at Riverside High consider transferring to other schools. "Nobody corrects me," she said, each word precise and deliberate. Nobody. Especially not some charity case who doesn't understand how things work around here. Emma had spent 9 years learning to read opponents, to recognize the signs of impending attack. and to calculate the precise moment when conflict became inevitable. Every instinct she had developed through thousands of hours of training told her that Jessica Walsh had just declared war, and that this war would not end with academic disagreement. But Emma Rodriguez had also learned something else during those years of training, something that would prove far more valuable than any technique or strategy. She had learned that sometimes the most powerful response to a threat is absolute calm, and that true strength reveals itself not in the decision to fight, but in the wisdom to choose exactly when fighting becomes necessary. So Emma simply nodded, turned back to her lab work, and completed the assignment with the kind of focused precision that had once earned her tournament victories. She said nothing more to Jessica for the remainder of the class period, and she offered no apology for her competence or her honesty. She had no way of knowing that this moment of quiet dignity would mark the beginning of the most dangerous period of her high school career, or that Jessica Walsh's wounded pride would soon escalate into a campaign of systematic destruction designed to teach everyone at Riverside High what happened to students who forgot their place in the carefully maintained hierarchy. The war for Emma Rodriguez's dignity was about to begin, and she would discover that some battles could only be won by embracing the warrior she had spent months trying to forget. The first attack came on a Wednesday morning, subtle as poison and twice as effective. Emma arrived at her locker to find a sticky substance coating the combination lock, making it impossible to open without getting the mysterious goo all over her hands. The substance smelled faintly of vanilla and had the consistency of honey mixed with glue, clearly designed to ruin anything it touched while maintaining an air of innocent accident. Emma studied the mess with the same analytical approach she brought to chemistry problems. The placement was too precise to be accidental, the timing too convenient given yesterday's confrontation with Jessica Walsh. But proving intentional sabotage would be impossible, and complaining about it would only draw the kind of attention Emma had spent months avoiding. She solved the problem the way she solved most obstacles in her life, with practical efficiency and minimal drama. Using a pencil eraser and some water from the drinking fountain, she carefully cleaned the lock mechanism, retrieved her books, and proceeded to her first period class as if nothing had happened. The incident cost her 5 minutes and a small amount of dignity. But Emma had endured far worse during her father's military transfers and her grandmother's strict discipline regimen. What she couldn't have anticipated was that this minor inconvenience was merely the opening gambit in a campaign that Jessica Walsh had been planning since their chemistry lab confrontation. Jessica hadn't spent the previous evening fuming about academic corrections or nursing wounded pride. She had been conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence, and designing a systematic approach to destroying Emma Rodriguez's carefully constructed invisibility. Jessica Walsh approached psychological warfare with the same methodical precision that Fortune 500 companies applied to hostile takeovers. She understood that effective destruction required careful preparation, strategic timing, and most importantly, complete deniability. The goal wasn't just to hurt Emma Rodriguez, it was to demonstrate to everyone at Riverside High what happened to students who challenged Jessica's authority while maintaining her own reputation as someone above such petty concerns. The second phase of Jessica's campaign began during lunch period that same Wednesday. Emma typically ate alone in the library, where she could read while consuming the simple sandwich and fruit that constituted her daily meal. The library was quiet, supervised by Mrs. Henderson, who rarely bothered students unless they were actively disruptive, and most importantly, it was largely ignored by the social circles that Jessica Walsh dominated. Emma was halfway through a chapter about organic compound synthesis when she became aware of voices nearby, just loud enough to be audible, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. The conversation seemed to be taking place between Brittany Chen and Ashley Kim, Jessica's most loyal lieutenants, but their words were clearly intended for a broader audience. "Did you hear about that girl in chemistry class?" Brittany was saying, her voice carrying just far enough for Emma to catch every word. "The one who thinks she's so much smarter than everyone else because she gets good grades." Ashley's response was equally theatrical. "Oh, you mean the scholarship girl? I heard she actually corrected Jessica Walsh in front of the whole class. Can you imagine being that desperate for attention?" Emma kept her eyes focused on her textbook, but her peripheral vision caught the subtle performance taking place 3 tables away. Both girls were speaking slightly louder than necessary, their body language designed to suggest casual conversation while ensuring their words reached their intended target. Other students in the library had begun to take notice, some openly listening while others pretended to focus on their own work. "I heard her family is on food stamps," Brittany continued, her tone suggesting she was sharing classified information rather than malicious gossip. "Apparently her father abandoned them and they had to move here because they couldn't afford to live anywhere decent." The lies were crafted with enough plausibility to be believable, while being devastating enough to reshape Emma's social status at Riverside High. In a community where family reputation carried significant weight, suggestions of abandonment and poverty weren't just personal attacks. They were social death sentences that could follow a student for years. Emma felt her jaw clench involuntarily, the first crack in the composure she had maintained since arriving at Riverside High. Her father hadn't abandoned anyone. He was serving his country in Afghanistan, risking his life daily to provide for his family and protect American interests overseas. Her family wasn't on food stamps. They qualified for free lunch because military pay didn't stretch far when supporting a family across multiple time zones. These weren't shameful secrets to be hidden. They were sacrifices that deserved respect rather than ridicule. But explaining the truth would require acknowledging that she had heard the conversation, which would escalate the situation beyond her ability to control. Emma had learned during her father's various deployments that sometimes the strongest response to unfair attacks was dignified silence, allowing the attackers to reveal their own character while maintaining her own integrity. So Emma finished her sandwich, completed her reading assignment, and returned her library materials to their proper locations without giving any indication that she had heard the carefully orchestrated performance. She walked to her next class with the same steady pace she maintained every day, her expression calm and her posture straight. But something fundamental had shifted during that lunch period. Jessica Walsh had successfully moved their conflict from private disagreements to public humiliation, and Emma understood that this was only the beginning of a campaign designed to systematically destroy her reputation and her peace of mind. The attacks continued throughout the week, each one carefully calibrated to cause maximum damage while maintaining minimum risk for Jessica and her allies. Emma's homework disappeared from her backpack, forcing her to explain to teachers why her assignments were incomplete. Her gym clothes were doused with a substance that smelled like rotting fish, making her presence unpleasant for anyone nearby. Her locker combination was changed repeatedly, forcing her to request custodial assistance that drew unwanted attention and administrative suspicion. Each incident was technically explainable through accident or coincidence, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Emma Rodriguez was being systematically targeted by forces that possessed both the creativity to design effective harassment and the influence to avoid consequences for their actions. The psychological pressure was carefully designed to force Emma into one of two responses. She could escalate by reporting the harassment to school administrators, which would require her to make accusations she couldn't prove against students with significant family influence. Alternatively, she could submit to the campaign by acknowledging Jessica's social superiority and accepting a permanently diminished status at Riverside High. What Jessica hadn't anticipated was that Emma Rodriguez possessed a third option, one that had been developed through years of military discipline and martial arts training. Emma could endure. She absorbed each attack with the same stoic acceptance that had carried her through her father's deployments, her family's financial struggles, and the countless relocations that had defined her childhood. She developed workarounds for every obstacle Jessica's campaign created, arriving early to clean her locker, keeping her assignments in multiple locations, and maintaining backup plans for every aspect of her school routine. More importantly, Emma began to study her attackers with the same methodical attention she had once devoted to learning kata forms and sparring techniques. She observed the timing of the harassment, noting patterns in when and where incidents occurred. She identified the specific methods Jessica's team preferred, cataloging their strengths and weaknesses. She began to understand the psychological profile of her opponents, recognizing their need for audience approval and their dependence on institutional protection. Emma Rodriguez was gathering intelligence, and intelligence would prove to be her most valuable weapon when the conflict inevitably escalated beyond psychological games. The first crack in Jessica's careful strategy appeared on a Friday afternoon when Emma walked into her chemistry class to find her lab station completely destroyed. Beakers were shattered, her notebook was soaked with water and unidentifiable chemicals, and her carefully organized materials were scattered across the floor like debris from an explosion. Mrs. Patterson stood over the mess with the expression of someone who had reached the absolute limit of her patience. This was the third incident of vandalism in her classroom this semester, and the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. More importantly, the destruction had occurred during lunch period when only a handful of students had access to the chemistry lab, making the list of potential suspects embarrassingly short. Emma surveyed the damage with the detached professionalism of a crime scene investigator. The destruction was thorough but not random. Someone had taken the time to ensure that every piece of her work was ruined while leaving neighboring lab stations completely untouched. The perpetrator had also been careful to avoid damaging school property, suggesting someone who understood the difference between harassment and actual criminal destruction. "Miss Rodriguez," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional frustration, "this is completely unacceptable. I want you to know that I will be investigating this incident thoroughly and taking appropriate action against whoever is responsible." Emma nodded respectfully, but she understood the practical limitations of Mrs. Patterson's investigation. The teacher was genuinely outraged by the vandalism, but she had no real power to challenge students whose families funded school programs and influenced administrative decisions. Any investigation would quickly run into the same political obstacles that had protected Jessica Walsh throughout her academic career. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson," Emma replied quietly. "I appreciate your concern. I can replace most of these materials before our next lab session." The response clearly wasn't what Mrs. Patterson had expected. Most students would have demanded justice, insisted on punishment for the perpetrators, or at minimum expressed anger about the destruction of their work. Emma's calm acceptance of the situation seemed to frustrate the teacher more than the vandalism itself. "Miss Rodriguez," Mrs. Patterson continued, her tone suggesting she was trying to communicate something beyond her actual words. "You don't have to accept this kind of treatment. There are procedures for dealing with harassment, resources available to help students who are being targeted." Emma met the teacher's eyes and saw a genuine concern mixed with professional helplessness. Mrs. Patterson clearly understood what was happening, but she was also aware of her own limitations within the school's political structure. She was offering help while simultaneously acknowledging that her help might not be sufficient to address the real problem. "I understand," Emma said, her voice carrying quiet dignity that seemed far beyond her 16 years. "I'll let you know if the situation requires additional intervention." What Mrs. Patterson couldn't have known was that Emma Rodriguez had already decided that additional intervention would indeed be required, but not the kind that school administrators could provide. Emma was beginning to understand that Jessica Walsh's campaign would continue escalating until it forced a response that went beyond institutional procedures and official policies. The question wasn't whether the conflict would eventually require Emma to draw upon skills that had nothing to do with academic achievement or social navigation. The question was when Jessica would push far enough to make that response inevitable, and whether Emma would be able to control the situation when that moment arrived. That evening, Emma sat in her grandmother's small living room, ostensibly working on homework but actually processing the events of the previous week. Her grandmother, Rosa Rodriguez, was a woman who had raised 4 children through poverty, divorce, and social upheaval while maintaining the kind of inner strength that had once intimidated Emma's military father. Rosa possessed an uncanny ability to sense when her granddaughter was dealing with problems that went beyond ordinary teenage drama. "Mija," Rosa said without looking up from her knitting, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had navigated far worse challenges than high school politics. "You have been very quiet this week, more quiet than usual." Emma considered several possible responses, ranging from complete honesty to casual deflection. Her grandmother had enough concerns without adding teenage social problems to her list of worries, but Rosa Rodriguez was also the kind of woman who could detect deception from 3 rooms away. "I'm having some difficulties at school," Emma admitted carefully. "Nothing I can't handle, but it's been distracting." Rosa set down her knitting and fixed Emma with the kind of stare that had once convinced hardened military officers to reconsider their positions on family housing policies. Her granddaughter's carefully controlled demeanor told her everything she needed to know about the severity of the situation. "What kind of difficulties?" Rosa asked, her tone making it clear that evasive answers would not be acceptable. Emma found herself describing the previous week's events in more detail than she had intended, outlining Jessica's campaign while trying to minimize the psychological impact it was having on her daily life. She explained the vandalism, the social manipulation, and the systematic attempts to destroy her reputation while emphasizing her own ability to cope with the harassment. Rosa listened without interruption, her expression growing progressively more serious as Emma's account continued. When her granddaughter finished speaking, Rosa remained silent for several minutes, processing the information with the same methodical approach that had carried her through decades of single parenthood and social challenges. "This girl and her friends," Rosa finally said, her voice carrying dangerous calm, "they think you are weak because you are quiet. They think because you do not fight back that you cannot fight back." Emma nodded, recognizing the accuracy of her grandmother's assessment. Jessica Walsh had indeed mistaken strategic patience for genuine helplessness, a miscalculation that revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of Emma's character and capabilities. "Your father taught you to fight for good reasons," Rosa continued, her eyes holding memories of military training sessions and tournament victories. "He taught you to protect yourself and others who cannot protect themselves. He did not teach you to be a victim." The words hit Emma with unexpected force, cutting through months of careful self-control and strategic withdrawal. She had been so focused on avoiding conflict and maintaining invisibility that she had forgotten the lessons her father had drilled into her about standing up to bullies and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "But, abuela," Emma said, using the childhood term that still felt natural despite her 16 years, "if I fight back, it will only make things worse. Jessica's family has too much influence. The school will take her side." Rosa's laugh was sharp and knowing, the sound of someone who had faced similar challenges and emerged victorious through methods that school administrators never learned about. "Mija," she said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone sharing classified information, "there are many ways to fight back. Some of them happen in principals' offices and school board meetings. Others happen in places where family influence cannot reach." Emma understood that her grandmother wasn't advocating violence or revenge, but she was suggesting that Emma had options beyond passive endurance and institutional appeals. Rosa Rodriguez had survived decades of social and economic challenges by understanding when to work within systems and when to work around them. The conversation continued for another hour, touching on subjects that ranged from tactical patience to strategic timing. Rosa shared stories from her own youth, describing conflicts with employers, neighbors, and social groups that had required solutions beyond conventional approaches. She talked about the importance of choosing battles carefully while never allowing others to mistake strategic restraint for genuine weakness. By the time Emma went to bed that night, she had made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her conflict with Jessica Walsh. She would continue to endure the harassment and avoid escalation for as long as possible, but she would also begin preparing for the possibility that patience alone might not be sufficient to resolve the situation. Emma Rodriguez was about to rediscover skills she had spent months trying to forget, and when Jessica Walsh eventually pushed beyond the boundaries of psychological warfare, she would discover that the quiet girl from chemistry class possessed capabilities that no amount of family influence could neutralize. The war was about to enter a new phase, and Emma intended to be ready for whatever came next. The notification appeared on Emma's phone at 11:47 p.m. on a Sunday night, a gentle ping that shattered the quiet peace of her evening study session. She glanced at the screen expecting a message from her father overseas or perhaps a reminder about tomorrow's chemistry quiz. Instead, she found herself staring at a friend request from an Instagram account she didn't recognize. The profile belonged to someone named Millbrook Truth with a generic sunset photo and 0 followers. Emma's first instinct was to decline the request and return to her organic chemistry notes, but something about the timing felt deliberate and threatening. Against her better judgment, she accepted the request and immediately received a direct message that made her blood run cold. The message contained a photo taken during her chemistry lab session with Jessica Walsh, but the image had been manipulated to suggest something far more inappropriate than academic collaboration. Emma's face had been edited onto a body in a compromising position, and the caption suggested relationships and activities that would destroy her reputation if widely circulated. The manipulation was sophisticated enough to appear genuine at first glance, but obvious enough upon closer inspection to maintain plausible deniability for whoever had created it. Below the doctored image was a simple message, typed in the kind of casual tone that made threats even more chilling. "Thought you should see what people are saying about you. This is just the beginning unless you learn your place at Riverside High. Some girls need to understand that certain boys are off limits and certain families deserve respect." Emma stared at the message for several minutes, her mind processing the implications with the same analytical approach she brought to complex academic problems. This wasn't random cyberbullying or adolescent revenge. It was sophisticated psychological warfare designed to isolate her from potential allies while demonstrating Jessica Walsh's reach and resources. The reference to certain boys was particularly confusing, since Emma had shown no romantic interest in anyone at Riverside High, but the threat was unmistakable regardless of its accuracy. She took screenshots of both the doctored image and the threatening message, then blocked the account and reported it to Instagram. But Emma understood that blocking one fake account would accomplish nothing if Jessica Walsh had decided to escalate their conflict into digital territory. Social media harassment was notoriously difficult to prove and even harder to prosecute, especially when the perpetrators had resources and technical sophistication. The next morning brought confirmation that the digital campaign was just beginning. Emma arrived at school to find students whispering and staring more than usual, their conversations stopping abruptly when she walked past. Several classmates who had previously ignored her now watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to disgust, suggesting that rumors were spreading faster than she could track or counter. The situation became clearer during her morning break when Jake Wilson approached her near the library entrance. Jake was one of the few students at Riverside High who existed in the same social limbo as Emma, too quiet to be popular but too intelligent to be ignored completely. He possessed the kind of technical skills that made him valuable for group projects while remaining invisible during social events. "Emma," Jake said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard, "you need to know that there are fake social media accounts posting things about you. Really bad things that could get you in serious trouble if teachers or administrators see them." Emma nodded, grateful for the warning while dreading the details. "What kind of things?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jake pulled out his phone and showed her a series of fake profiles, each using slightly different versions of her name and photos stolen from her legitimate social media accounts. The posts were carefully crafted to suggest drug use, sexual promiscuity, and academic dishonesty, while maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid outright defamation claims. Most disturbing were the posts that had been designed to look like Emma was bragging about manipulating teachers and cheating on assignments. "The accounts have been active for about a week," Jake explained, his voice carrying the frustration of someone who understood technology well enough to recognize sophisticated manipulation. "Whoever created them knows what they're doing. The posts are timed to maximize visibility, the language patterns match your writing style, and they're using IP spoofing to make them appear legitimate." Emma felt a chill of recognition as she processed Jake's technical analysis. This level of digital sophistication suggested resources beyond what typical high school students possessed, indicating either adult assistance or access to professional-grade tools. Jessica Walsh's family connections suddenly seemed even more dangerous than Emma had initially realized. "Can you trace them back to whoever created them?" Emma asked, though she already suspected the answer. Jake shook his head with the grim expression of someone delivering bad news. "The accounts are using VPN services and proxy servers that mask their real location. Even if I could crack through those protections, actually proving who created them would require law enforcement resources that nobody's going to deploy for high school drama." Emma thanked Jake for the information and spent the rest of her morning classes thinking about the implications of Jessica's digital campaign. The fake social media accounts were more than just harassment. They were reputation assassination designed to destroy her credibility with teachers, administrators, and potential allies. Worse yet, the sophisticated technical implementation suggested that Jessica had access to resources and expertise that made fighting back through conventional means nearly impossible. The psychological impact of the digital warfare became apparent during lunch period, when Emma discovered that her usual table in the library was occupied by students she didn't recognize. When she approached, one of them looked up with an expression of disgust that seemed entirely disproportionate to her presence. "Excuse me," the student said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "but we're not comfortable sitting near someone with your reputation. Maybe you should find somewhere else to eat." Emma stood frozen for a moment, processing the reality that Jessica's campaign had successfully poisoned her relationships with students she had never even spoken to. The fake social media posts were creating a version of Emma Rodriguez that bore no resemblance to reality, but appeared convincing enough to influence social dynamics throughout Riverside High. She retreated to the hallway outside the library, eating her sandwich while standing against a wall and trying to process the speed with which her social situation was deteriorating. Students walking past gave her strange looks, some curious and others openly hostile. Emma realized that she was witnessing the power of modern digital harassment, where lies could spread faster than truth and perception could become reality regardless of facts. The situation escalated dramatically during her afternoon physical education class, which Emma had been dreading since seeing Jake's technical analysis of the fake accounts. PE was the one class where students were required to change clothes and shower, creating opportunities for harassment that went beyond verbal taunts or digital manipulation. Emma had always been careful about her privacy during PE, arriving early to claim a corner locker and changing clothes as quickly as possible to minimize exposure to potential problems. But today felt different from the moment she entered the locker room. Conversations stopped when she appeared, and she could feel hostile stares tracking her movement as she made her way to her usual corner. The PE teacher, Mrs. Martinez, had announced that today's activity would be swimming, which meant using the pool facilities and locker rooms that offered even less privacy than the regular gymnasium. Emma felt her anxiety increase as she realized that the swimming unit would require her to be more vulnerable than any previous PE activity. As she changed into her modest one-piece swimsuit, Emma became aware of whispered conversations taking place nearby. The words were too quiet to understand clearly, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. When she turned around, she found herself facing Jessica Walsh, Brittany Chen, and Ashley Kim, all wearing designer swimwear that probably cost more than Emma's entire wardrobe. "Well, well," Jessica said, her voice carrying the false sweetness that Emma had learned to recognize as particularly dangerous, if it isn't Riverside High's most infamous student. "I heard you've been making quite a name for yourself on social media." Emma said nothing, focusing on gathering her towel and preparing to leave the locker room as quickly as possible. But Jessica stepped directly into her path, blocking her exit while maintaining the kind of innocent expression that would appear completely harmless to any adults who might be watching. "You know," Jessica continued, her tone suggesting casual conversation while her eyes promised something far more threatening, "some girls just don't understand how to behave appropriately around here. They think they can do whatever they want without consequences." Brittany and Ashley moved to flank Emma, creating a triangle formation that effectively trapped her in the corner of the locker room. Their positioning was subtle enough to appear accidental to casual observation, but clearly intentional to anyone who understood group dynamics and spatial control. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Emma said quietly, trying to maintain calm while calculating possible escape routes. "I haven't done anything inappropriate on social media or anywhere else." Jessica's laugh was sharp and knowing, the sound of someone who held all the cards in a game that Emma was just beginning to understand. "Oh, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "you really don't get it, do you? It doesn't matter what you actually did. What matters is what people think you did." Ashley stepped closer, her voice joining the coordinated psychological pressure. "We've seen the posts, Emma. Everyone has seen them. The pictures, the stories about what you do with teachers to get good grades. It's really disgusting." Emma felt her composure beginning to crack as she realized the full scope of what Jessica had orchestrated. The fake social media accounts weren't just harassment. They were character assassination designed to destroy her relationships with everyone from fellow students to faculty members. Even if she could prove the accounts were fake, the damage to her reputation might be irreversible. "Those accounts are fabricated," Emma said, her voice remaining steady despite the anger building in her chest. "Anyone who looks closely can see that the photos are manipulated, and the posts don't match my actual writing style." Jessica's expression shifted to mock sympathy, the kind of exaggerated concern that adults often mistook for genuine kindness. "Oh, honey," she said, reaching out as if to touch Emma's shoulder in a gesture of comfort, "nobody cares about technical details when the story is this entertaining. High school students love drama, and you've become the most dramatic story at Riverside High." The locker room had gradually filled with other students preparing for swimming class, but Emma noticed that most of them were keeping their distance from the confrontation taking place in the corner. Some watched with open curiosity while others pretended to focus on their own preparations, but nobody seemed inclined to intervene or offer support. Emma realized that she was witnessing the effectiveness of Jessica's comprehensive campaign. The psychological harassment had isolated her from potential allies, The digital warfare had destroyed her reputation, and now she was facing direct confrontation without any social protection or institutional support. Jessica Walsh had successfully created conditions where Emma's options were limited to submission or escalation. But Emma Rodriguez had learned something during her years of martial arts training that Jessica Walsh couldn't have anticipated. She had learned that the most dangerous moment in any conflict was when your opponent believed they had already won, because that was when they became careless and overconfident. The swimming class itself passed without major incident, though Emma was acutely aware of the whispers and stares that followed her throughout the period. She completed the required laps with mechanical precision, her body moving through the water while her mind processed the strategic implications of Jessica's escalating campaign. Mrs. Martinez, the PE teacher, seemed oblivious to the social dynamics playing out in her class, focused instead on timing laps and ensuring that students met the swimming requirements. But Emma caught the teacher glancing in her direction several times with an expression that suggested growing concern about something she couldn't quite identify. The real confrontation came after class, in the locker room where students were showering and changing back into their regular clothes. Emma had been hoping to change quickly and escape before any further harassment could occur, but Jessica Walsh had apparently been planning something more dramatic than verbal intimidation. Emma was halfway through changing clothes when she heard the distinctive sound of multiple phones being activated simultaneously. She turned to find Jessica, Brittany, and Ashley pointing their devices in her direction, clearly recording video while she was in various stages of undress. The violation was so sudden and unexpected that Emma froze for a moment, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The three girls were filming her without consent while she was changing clothes, creating exactly the kind of compromising material that could destroy her reputation permanently if it was distributed online. "Delete those videos right now," Emma said, her voice carrying an edge that none of the girls had heard before. "What you're doing is illegal." Jessica's response was immediate and chilling. "Is it really illegal if we're just documenting the kind of person who creates fake social media accounts and spreads rumors about other students? I think we're performing a public service by showing everyone who you really are." The logic was twisted but strategically brilliant. Jessica was using Emma's reaction to the harassment as justification for even more severe harassment, creating a spiral of escalation where any response Emma made could be portrayed as further evidence of her supposed bad character. But Emma Rodriguez had reached the point where strategic patience was no longer sufficient to protect her dignity and safety. 9 years of martial arts training had taught her to recognize the moment when defensive options were exhausted and offensive action became necessary. Jessica Walsh had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and Emma was done being a victim. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. Emma's posture shifted from defensive to balanced, her breathing became controlled and rhythmic, and her eyes took on the focused intensity that her sensei had once described as the moment when a student stopped being a student and became a warrior. "You have 3 seconds to delete those videos and put your phones away," Emma said, her voice carrying quiet authority that made several nearby students stop what they were doing to pay attention. Jessica looked around at her allies with amused confidence, clearly believing that she had pushed Emma past the breaking point and was about to witness a complete emotional breakdown that would provide even more material for public humiliation. "Or what?" Jessica asked, her tone suggesting that she found Emma's newfound confidence more entertaining than threatening. "You'll tell a teacher? File a complaint? We both know that nobody cares about your problems." Emma took one step forward, her movement so controlled and precise that it seemed almost ceremonial. The step wasn't aggressive enough to be considered an attack, but it carried implications that made Brittany and Ashley instinctively step backward, even as Jessica held her ground. "I'll handle this myself," Emma said quietly, and something in her tone made every student in the locker room understand that the rules of their conflict were about to change permanently. Jessica Walsh was about to discover that the quiet girl from chemistry class possessed capabilities that no amount of family influence could neutralize, and that some lines could only be crossed once before the consequences became irreversible. The silence in the locker room stretched like a taut wire, pregnant with potential energy that everyone present could feel but nobody quite understood. Emma Rodriguez stood perfectly still, her breathing controlled and her posture balanced in a way that suggested coiled springs ready to release. Around her, the usual chaos of students changing clothes had stopped as if someone had pressed a pause button on the entire scene. Jessica Walsh held her phone steady, still recording. But something in Emma's demeanor had shifted the power dynamic in ways that Jessica was only beginning to comprehend. The confident smirk that had been Jessica's trademark expression faltered slightly as she registered the change in her target's body language and vocal tone. For months, Emma had been the perfect victim, absorbing harassment with stoic patience and responding to escalation with strategic withdrawal. Jessica had built her entire campaign around the assumption that Emma Rodriguez was fundamentally passive, someone who would endure any amount of abuse rather than fight back effectively. That assumption was about to prove catastrophically wrong. Emma's grandmother had once told her that there were moments in life when choosing not to act was itself a form of action, and that wisdom required understanding the difference between strategic patience and enabling evil. As Emma stood in that locker room, surrounded by students who had either participated in her harassment or stood by while it happened, she understood that this was one of those moments when inaction would be its own form of moral failure. The recording devices pointed in her direction weren't just violations of her privacy. They were weapons being used to destroy her future opportunities and relationships. The fake social media accounts weren't just cruel pranks. They were character assassination designed to isolate her from every potential source of support. Jessica Walsh hadn't just been bullying Emma Rodriguez. She had been systematically destroying her ability to exist safely in the community that was supposed to be her home. Emma had tried patience. She had tried withdrawal. She had tried enduring the harassment while hoping that Jessica would eventually lose interest and move on to other targets. But Jessica Walsh had interpreted Emma's restraint as weakness, and her escalation had now reached the point where passive resistance was no longer sufficient to protect Emma's dignity or safety. The time for strategic patience had ended. Emma's movement was so fast that most of the students in the locker room missed it entirely. One moment she was standing 3 feet away from Jessica, and the next moment Jessica's phone was flying through the air to land with a satisfying crack against the tile wall. The motion had been a simple wrist control technique, applied with surgical precision to disarm without causing injury, but executed with the kind of speed that suggested years of practiced muscle memory. Jessica stared at her shattered phone in shock, her brain struggling to process what had just happened. The device that had contained months of harassment material was now scattered across the locker room floor in pieces too small to recover. But more disturbing than the destruction of her phone was the realization that Emma Rodriguez possessed physical capabilities that Jessica had never suspected. "What did you just do?" Jessica demanded, her voice rising to a pitch that suggested genuine fear beginning to mix with her usual arrogance. "You can't just destroy people's property. I'm calling the police." Emma's response was delivered in the same controlled tone she had used throughout their entire conflict, but now it carried undertones that made every student in the locker room pay attention with sudden intensity. "You were illegally recording someone without consent while they were changing clothes," Emma said, each word precisely articulated. "That's a felony in Oregon, punishable by up to 5 years in prison and registration as a sex offender. I was defending myself against criminal activity." The legal accuracy of Emma's statement hit the locker room like a physical force. Students who had been watching the confrontation with casual entertainment suddenly realized they had been witnessing something far more serious than typical high school drama. Brittany and Ashley, who were still holding their own phones, quickly powered them down and stepped away from Jessica as if she had become radioactive. Jessica's face cycled through several emotions in rapid succession, starting with disbelief, progressing through anger, and settling into something that resembled genuine panic. She had been so focused on the immediate gratification of humiliating Emma that she hadn't considered the legal implications of her actions. The recording that was supposed to be her greatest victory had become evidence of her own criminal behavior. "You're lying," Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. "High school students can't be charged with stuff like that. My family has lawyers who would destroy you if you tried to press charges." Emma reached into her gym bag and pulled out her own phone, which had been recording audio since the moment Jessica had started making threats about filming her. The device had captured every word of the harassment, including Jessica's explicit admission that she was creating compromising material for the purpose of destroying Emma's reputation. "Your family's lawyers will have more important things to worry about," Emma said calmly. "Once the district attorney receives copies of your fake social media accounts, this audio recording, and witness statements from students who watched you commit felony harassment. Political influence doesn't extend to federal cyberbullying charges." The mention of federal charges caused visible panic among Jessica's allies. Brittany Chen's wealthy parents had always protected her from consequences, but they had also made it clear that certain types of legal problems would result in her being cut off from family resources. Ashley Kim realized that her college applications could be destroyed by criminal charges, regardless of her family's social connections. For the first time since beginning her campaign against Emma Rodriguez, Jessica Walsh found herself in a position where her usual advantages didn't apply. Criminal law operated according to different rules than high school social dynamics, and evidence of deliberate harassment could create problems that no amount of family influence could solve. But Jessica Walsh hadn't maintained her position at Riverside High by backing down when challenged, and she wasn't about to start now. Her next move revealed both her desperation and her fundamental misunderstanding of who she was really dealing with. "You think you're so smart?" Jessica snarled, abandoning any pretense of civility or plausible deniability. "You think because you got lucky once that you can threaten me? Nobody talks to me that way. Nobody." She lunged forward with the kind of wild aggression that characterized someone who had never been in a real physical confrontation, reaching for Emma's phone with both hands while screaming threats that would have been laughable if they weren't so genuinely menacing. Emma's response was automatic, a reaction honed by thousands of hours of training and refined by years of sparring with partners who possessed far more skill and control than Jessica Walsh could imagine. She sidestepped Jessica's clumsy attack with minimal effort, using her opponent's momentum to execute a basic hip throw that sent Jessica tumbling across the slippery locker room floor. The technique was textbook perfect, designed to neutralize an attack while minimizing injury to the aggressor. Jessica landed hard but safely, her dignity more damaged than her body, sliding several feet across the wet tiles before coming to rest against a row of lockers with a metallic clang that echoed through the suddenly silent room. Emma remained in a ready stance, perfectly balanced and completely calm, while Jessica struggled to regain her footing on the wet floor. The contrast between their physical capabilities was now unmistakable to everyone present. Emma Rodriguez wasn't just defending herself. She was demonstrating a level of martial arts skill that belonged in tournament competition rather than high school locker rooms. "That's impossible," Brittany whispered, her voice carrying the awe of someone witnessing something beyond her comprehension. "She's tiny. How did she do that?" Emma turned to address the growing crowd of students who had gathered to watch the confrontation, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people listen without question. "I've been training in Shotokan karate since I was 7 years old," she said, her tone suggesting she was sharing information rather than making threats. "My father is deployed with the 82nd Airborne Division, and he made sure I could protect myself before he left. I've won 3 state championships and placed second in nationals twice." The revelation hit the locker room like a thunderclap. Emma Rodriguez, the quiet girl who had endured months of harassment without fighting back, was revealing herself to be one of the most skilled martial artists anyone at Riverside High had ever encountered. Her restraint hadn't been weakness. It had been the self-control of someone who understood exactly how much damage she could cause if she chose to. Jessica struggled to her feet, her designer swimwear now soaked, and her carefully styled hair plastered against her head. But rather than accepting defeat, she made the kind of decision that would haunt her for years afterward. She decided to escalate further. "I don't care what you think you know about fighting," Jessica screamed, her voice echoing off the tile walls with hysterical intensity. "You're nothing. Your family is nothing. When I'm done with you, nobody at this school will even remember your name." She charged again, this time with the desperate fury of someone who had never been denied anything she wanted. But desperation and fury were poor substitutes for training and discipline, and Emma Rodriguez had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Emma's counter was swift and decisive. She caught Jessica's wrist in a grip that immediately immobilized her arm, stepped behind her opponent with fluid precision, and applied a standing arm lock that brought Jessica to her knees while applying exactly enough pressure to control without causing permanent damage. The technique was designed to end confrontations quickly and safely, demonstrating overwhelming superiority while offering the opponent an opportunity to surrender with minimal injury. Emma held the position for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to establish complete control, before releasing Jessica and stepping back to a safe distance. Jessica knelt on the wet floor, gasping and holding her arm while her brain struggled to process what had just happened. She had been neutralized so completely and efficiently that she barely understood how she had ended up on the ground. The physical dominance was absolute, but the psychological impact was even more devastating. "This ends now," Emma said, her voice carrying finality that made everyone in the locker room understand that negotiation was no longer possible. "You're gonna delete every fake social media account. You're gonna stop spreading rumors. You're gonna leave me alone, and you're gonna tell everyone else to leave me alone." Jessica looked around the locker room, seeking support from allies who were now backing away from her, as if she had become contagious. Brittany and Ashley avoided eye contact, clearly unwilling to associate themselves with someone who had been so thoroughly defeated. Other students watched with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction, apparently pleased to see someone finally stand up to Jessica's reign of terror. "You can't make me do anything," Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. Her usual confidence had been shattered along with her phone, and she was beginning to understand that her position at Riverside High had been built on foundations that no longer existed. Emma pulled out her phone and began scrolling through contacts with deliberate slowness, her actions suggesting access to resources that Jessica had never considered. "Option 1, Emma said calmly. "You comply with my requirements and we resolve this privately." Option 2, "I send this audio recording to the district attorney, the school board, and the local news stations that love stories about wealthy students abusing their privileges." Option 3, "I call my father's commanding officer and request assistance dealing with harassment of a military family member." The mention of military intervention caused visible panic among the watching students. Most teenagers understood that involving active-duty military personnel in civilian conflicts was like calling in nuclear weapons for a neighborhood dispute. Jessica Walsh's family might have local political influence, but that influence would be meaningless against federal military authorities investigating harassment of a service member's family. "The choice is yours," Emma continued, her tone suggesting that she was completely prepared to follow through on any of her stated options. "But you need to decide right now, because my patience with this situation has officially expired." Jessica Walsh stared at Emma Rodriguez for what felt like an eternity, her mind cycling through all the ways she could continue fighting and finding no scenarios that ended in her favor. For the first time in her privileged life, she was facing someone who possessed superior resources, superior skills, and superior moral authority. Every advantage she had relied upon throughout her academic career had been neutralized by someone she had dismissed as powerless. "Fine," Jessica said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll delete the accounts." "All of them," Emma said firmly. "Every fake profile, every manipulated photo, every piece of harassment material you've created. And you'll do it right now, in front of witnesses, using whatever devices you have that still work." Jessica looked around the locker room one final time, seeking any possible escape from the complete humiliation she was about to endure. But the faces staring back at her offered no sympathy or support. Some students seemed pleased by her downfall, others appeared shocked by the revelation of Emma's capabilities, but none showed any inclination to help her avoid the consequences of her actions. The deletion process took nearly an hour, with Jessica forced to log into various fake accounts while Emma and several witnesses watched her remove every piece of harassment material she had created. Each deleted post represented months of work and planning, but Jessica no longer had any choice but to comply with Emma's demands. When the digital cleanup was finally complete, Emma made one final statement that would be remembered and quoted throughout Riverside High for years afterward. "Harassment stops today," she said, addressing the entire room rather than just Jessica. "Not just against me, but against everyone. If I hear about anyone in this school being targeted the way I was targeted, I will personally ensure that the perpetrators face consequences that go far beyond anything the administration might impose." The warning was delivered without anger or threat, but with the kind of quiet certainty that made it clear Emma Rodriguez meant every word. She had revealed capabilities that transformed her from victim to protector, and everyone present understood that the social dynamics at Riverside High had permanently shifted. Jessica Walsh gathered her wet clothes and broken phone, leaving the locker room in humiliated silence while other students gave her a wide berth. Her reign of terror was over, ended not by administrative intervention or parental complaints, but by someone who possessed the skills and moral courage to stand up when standing up became necessary. Emma Rodriguez finished changing into her regular clothes with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else in her life. But something fundamental had changed during that confrontation. She was no longer the invisible new student trying to avoid attention. She had become someone who commanded respect through demonstrated capability and moral authority. The news of Jessica Walsh's defeat spread through Riverside High with the speed that only truly shocking events achieve in closed communities. By the end of the school day, everyone knew that the quiet girl from chemistry class had revealed herself to be a martial arts expert who had single-handedly ended the most feared bullying campaign in the school's recent history. More importantly, students who had been suffering their own harassment began to understand that they had an ally who possessed both the ability and willingness to intervene when situations exceeded their capacity to handle alone. Emma Rodriguez had accidentally become the protector she had never intended to be, and Riverside High became a safer place for everyone. The formal consequences for Jessica Walsh extended far beyond her confrontation with Emma. The audio recordings and witness statements Emma had gathered were forwarded to appropriate authorities, resulting in disciplinary actions that would follow Jessica through her remaining time at Riverside High and beyond. Her college applications were affected, her social media presence was permanently monitored, and her family's political influence proved insufficient to shield her from consequences she had brought upon herself. But perhaps the most significant change was in Emma Rodriguez herself. She had rediscovered the warrior spirit her father had instilled in her, not for the purpose of hurting others, but for protecting herself and those who couldn't protect themselves. The quiet student who had tried so hard to remain invisible had become a visible force for justice and safety in her community. 6 months later, Emma Rodriguez stood in the same locker room where her confrontation with Jessica Walsh had taken place, but now she was surrounded by a dozen younger students who had volunteered for the self-defense classes she taught twice a week after school. Her students came from various backgrounds and social groups, united by their desire to learn the kind of skills that could help them handle harassment and bullying with confidence and effectiveness. The classes weren't just about martial arts techniques. They were about building the kind of inner strength and moral courage that Emma had demonstrated during her darkest moments at Riverside High. Students learned not just how to defend themselves physically, but how to recognize harassment, document evidence, and seek appropriate help when situations exceeded their ability to handle alone. Jessica Walsh had transferred to a private school across the state, her family having decided that a fresh start in a new environment might help her rebuild her reputation and her character. The last Emma had heard, Jessica was attending therapy and participating in community service programs designed to help her understand the impact of her actions on others. Emma felt no satisfaction in Jessica's downfall, only relief that the harassment had ended and hope that her former tormentor might eventually learn to use her intelligence and resources for positive purposes. The goal had never been revenge. It had been safety and justice for everyone who walked the halls of Riverside High. As Emma watched her students practice the techniques she had taught them, she reflected on the lessons she had learned during those difficult months. She had discovered that true strength wasn't about avoiding conflict or enduring harassment in silence. True strength was about knowing when to stand up, how to stand up effectively, and most importantly, why standing up was necessary not just for yourself, but for everyone who couldn't stand up for themselves. The quiet girl who had once tried so hard to be invisible had learned that some people are called to be visible, to serve as protectors and examples for others who face similar challenges. Emma Rodriguez had answered that call, and Riverside High School became a better place because she had found the courage to embrace her responsibilities as someone who possessed both the skills and the moral authority to make a difference. The locker room where everything had changed now echoed with the sounds of students learning to protect themselves and others, building the kind of community that Emma had always hoped to find but had never expected to create. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from transforming the conditions that create enemies in the first place. Emma Rodriguez had done exactly that, and her legacy would continue long after she graduated and moved on to the next chapter of her life. 3 weeks after the locker room confrontation that had transformed the social landscape of Riverside High, Emma Rodriguez discovered that victory carried responsibilities she had never anticipated. The quiet hallways she had once navigated as an invisible observer now buzzed with whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, not from hostility, but from a mixture of respect and curiosity that made her equally uncomfortable. Students who had never acknowledged her existence now sought her attention with requests that ranged from reasonable to absurd. Freshmen asked for protection from upperclassmen bullies. Seniors wanted advice about standing up to abusive boyfriends. Teachers inquired about her availability to mentor struggling students who might benefit from her unique combination of academic excellence and personal strength. Emma found herself occupying a position she had never sought, and wasn't entirely sure she wanted. The girl who had spent months perfecting the art of invisibility had become the most visible student at Riverside High, a symbol of resistance against institutional failure and social cruelty that carried weight far beyond her 16 years and slight physical presence. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the days immediately following Jessica Walsh's humiliation, Emma had hoped that life would return to something resembling normal routine. She would attend classes, complete assignments, and gradually fade back into the comfortable anonymity that had protected her through countless military relocations and family disruptions. But normal was no longer an option for someone who had demonstrated the kind of moral courage and practical capability that Emma had revealed during her confrontation with the school's most feared bully. Word of her martial arts background and her methodical dismantling of Jessica's harassment campaign had spread beyond Riverside High, reaching parents, community leaders, and even local media outlets hungry for positive stories about teenage resilience and justice. The first indication that Emma's life had permanently changed came during her Wednesday morning chemistry class, when Principal Richardson appeared in the doorway with an expression that suggested important business. Mrs. Patterson paused her lecture about molecular bonding to acknowledge the interruption, and Emma felt her stomach tighten as she realized that the principal's attention was focused entirely on her. "Miss Rodriguez," Principal Richardson said, his tone carrying the careful neutrality that administrators used when discussing sensitive topics, "I need to speak with you in my office when you have a moment." Emma nodded politely, but her mind immediately began calculating the possible reasons for administrative attention. Despite the clear evidence of Jessica's harassment campaign and her own obviously defensive actions, Emma understood that challenging powerful families often resulted in consequences for the challenger rather than the perpetrator. The walk to the principal's office felt longer than usual, with students tracking Emma's movement through hallways that seemed unusually quiet for a normal school day. She maintained her characteristic composure, but internally she was preparing for everything from suspension to criminal charges, depending on how effectively the Walsh family had mobilized their political resources. Principal Richardson's office reflected the conservative administrative culture that had allowed Jessica Walsh's harassment campaign to flourish unchecked for months. Family photos shared space with awards from local business organizations, and the walls displayed certificates recognizing the school's partnerships with influential community leaders whose children attended Riverside High. "Please sit down, Miss Rodriguez," Principal Richardson said, gesturing toward a chair that positioned Emma directly across from his imposing oak desk. "I want to discuss recent events and their impact on our school community." Emma settled into the chair with the same controlled grace she brought to martial arts demonstrations, her posture alert but relaxed, her expression attentive but not anxious. Years of military discipline had taught her that administrative conversations required careful listening and measured responses, regardless of their apparent purpose or tone. "I understand there was an incident in the girls' locker room last week," Principal Richardson continued, consulting notes that suggested he had been briefed extensively about the confrontation. "Several students have provided statements describing what they witnessed, and I wanted to hear your perspective on what occurred." Emma had anticipated this conversation and prepared accordingly. She pulled out her phone and set it on the desk between them. The device containing audio recordings, screenshot evidence, and documentation that painted a comprehensive picture of Jessica Walsh's months-long harassment campaign. "Mr. Richardson," Emma said, her voice carrying the kind of respectful authority that made adults pay attention despite her age, "I have extensive evidence of criminal harassment, including illegal recording attempts, cyberbullying through fake social media accounts, and coordination of systematic social isolation designed to damage my academic and personal reputation." She methodically presented the evidence while Principal Richardson's expression shifted from administrative neutrality to genuine concern, and finally, to something resembling panic. The documentation Emma had compiled was thorough enough to support both criminal charges and civil litigation, but more importantly, it revealed institutional failures that could expose the school district to significant legal liability. The fake social media accounts alone constituted felony harassment under Oregon state law, while the attempted recording in the locker room crossed federal boundaries related to child exploitation and privacy violations. But perhaps most damaging from the school's perspective was the clear evidence that multiple reports of harassment had been ignored or dismissed by administrators who prioritized political relationships over student safety. Ms. Rodriguez, Principal Richardson, said carefully, his tone suggesting he was beginning to understand the full scope of the legal problems facing his institution, "I want you to know that Riverside High takes harassment very seriously. We're prepared to take immediate action to address these concerns and ensure that all students feel safe and supported." Emma studied the principal's face, recognizing the expression of someone who had just realized that his careful political balancing act was about to collapse under the weight of documented evidence and legal scrutiny. Principal Richardson wasn't concerned about Emma's well-being. He was terrified about the consequences his administrative negligence might have for his career and the school's reputation. "Mr. Richardson," Emma replied, her voice remaining respectful despite the anger building in her chest, "you had opportunities to address these concerns months ago when I first reported incidents of harassment. The escalation to criminal activity occurred because institutional responses were inadequate to protect students from systematic abuse." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from immediate disciplinary measures to long-term policy changes designed to prevent similar harassment campaigns. Principal Richardson made promises about enhanced monitoring, improved reporting procedures, and comprehensive anti-bullying programs that sounded impressive but felt hollow given the school's recent track record. Emma left the meeting with assurances that Jessica Walsh would face appropriate consequences and that additional measures would be implemented to protect students from future harassment. But she also understood that institutional change was slow and unreliable, and that her own safety ultimately depended on her continued vigilance and preparedness, rather than administrative promises. The real transformation was happening outside official channels, in conversations between students who had witnessed Emma's confrontation with Jessica Walsh and recognized that the social dynamics at Riverside High were shifting in fundamental ways. For the first time in years, students were beginning to believe that resistance to bullying was possible, and that seeking help was more effective than suffering in silence. Emma's chemistry class partner, David Chen, was among the first to approach her with a request that revealed the broader impact her actions were having throughout the school community. David was Sarah Chen's younger brother, and his family had been devastated when their daughter was forced to transfer schools after reporting harassment that was ignored by administrators and dismissed by law enforcement. "Emma," David said during their lab session the following week, his voice carrying the kind of careful hope that suggested he was afraid to believe in the possibility he was about to describe, "My sister heard about what happened with Jessica Walsh. She wants to know if you would be willing to help other students who are dealing with similar problems." The request was both flattering and terrifying. Emma understood that accepting a role as some kind of anti-bullying advocate would make her a permanent target for students and families who benefited from the existing power structures at Riverside High. But she also recognized that her unique combination of skills and moral authority created opportunities to help vulnerable students in ways that traditional institutional responses had consistently failed to provide. "What kind of help is she thinking about?" Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. David pulled out his phone and showed Emma a series of text messages from students throughout the school district, all describing harassment situations that ranged from social isolation to criminal threats. The messages revealed a network of victims who had been suffering in silence, afraid to report incidents that previous experience had taught them would be ignored or minimized by authorities. "She's thinking about creating a support group," David explained, his words coming faster as he gained confidence in his proposal. "Students helping students, documenting incidents, providing witnesses when someone needs to make reports. Kind of like what you did with Jessica, but organized and ongoing." Emma felt her carefully constructed plans for returning to invisibility dissolving as she processed the implications of David's suggestion. Creating a formal organization would make her a permanent public figure at Riverside High, someone who commanded attention and carried responsibility for other people's safety and well-being. But the alternative was allowing the harassment to continue for other students who lacked her advantages and capabilities. Emma had been fortunate enough to possess martial arts training and family connections that provided protection when institutional systems failed. Most students facing similar harassment had no such resources, and their only options were endurance or escape. "I need to think about it," Emma said finally, though she was already beginning to understand that her decision had been made the moment she chose to stand up to Jessica Walsh in the locker room. That evening, Emma sat in her grandmother's living room, reviewing the evidence she had compiled during her conflict with Jessica Walsh while considering the broader implications of the choices she was facing. The documentation revealed patterns of harassment that extended far beyond her own experience, suggesting systematic problems that affected dozens of students throughout Riverside High. Her grandmother entered the room with 2 cups of tea and the kind of knowing expression that suggested she had been observing Emma's internal struggle with the wisdom that came from decades of navigating similar moral dilemmas. "Misha," Rosa said, settling into her favorite chair with the deliberate care of someone whose joints reminded her daily of her advancing age, "you have been very quiet since your troubles at school were resolved." This is not the quiet of someone who is at peace. Emma accepted the tea gratefully, using the warm ceramic mug to focus her thoughts while she considered how to articulate the complex emotions and responsibilities that had been weighing on her since her confrontation with Jessica Walsh. "Abuela," Emma said, using the childhood term that still felt natural despite her 16 years. "Other students want me to help them with problems similar to what I went through. They want to create some kind of organization to support students who are being harassed." Rosa listened without interruption as Emma described David Chen's proposal and the network of victims who were seeking assistance that traditional institutional channels had failed to provide. When Emma finished speaking, her grandmother remained silent for several minutes, her expression thoughtful as she processed the information and its implications. "Your father called yesterday," Rosa said finally, her words seemingly unrelated to their conversation but carrying implications that Emma was beginning to understand. "He wanted to know how you handled the situation with the girl who was causing problems." Emma felt her stomach tighten, wondering how much her grandmother had revealed about recent events and what her father's reaction might have been to learning that his daughter had been forced to use the skills he had taught her for personal protection. "I told him you handled it exactly the way he trained you to handle it," Rosa continued, her voice carrying pride mixed with something that might have been concern. "You protected yourself when protection was necessary, and you showed restraint when restraint was appropriate." He said, "Those are the qualities of someone who can be trusted with greater responsibilities." The words hit Emma with unexpected force, cutting through months of uncertainty about whether she had responded appropriately to Jessica Walsh's harassment campaign. Her father's approval meant that her actions had met the standards of someone who understood both the importance of self-defense and the moral obligations that came with possessing such capabilities. "But Abuela," Emma said, "accepting this role means I'll never be able to go back to being invisible. People will expect things from me that I'm not sure I'm ready to provide." Rosa's laugh carried the warmth of someone who had faced similar crossroads and emerged stronger for having chosen the more difficult path. "Misha," she said, reaching across the space between their chairs to touch Emma's hand with fingers that had once commanded respect in boardrooms and community organizations. "Visibility was never really an option for someone with your capabilities and your character. The only choice was whether you would use those gifts to help others or try to hide them from the world." The conversation continued past midnight, covering subjects that ranged from practical organization strategies to philosophical questions about moral obligation and personal responsibility. Rosa shared stories from her own youth, describing moments when she had been forced to choose between safety and service, between personal comfort and community welfare. By the time Emma went to bed, she had made a decision that would define the rest of her time at Riverside High and establish patterns of leadership that would follow her throughout her adult life. She would accept David Chen's proposal and work to create the kind of support organization that could protect vulnerable students from the systematic harassment that had nearly destroyed her own academic experience. The first meeting of what would eventually become known as the Riverside Student Safety Coalition took place the following Saturday in the public library's community room, a neutral location that provided privacy while remaining accessible to students from various social and economic backgrounds. Emma had expected perhaps 5 or 6 students to attend, mostly victims of harassment who were seeking practical advice about documentation and reporting procedures. Instead, she found herself facing nearly 30 teenagers who represented every social group and academic level at Riverside High. Some were obvious harassment victims, students whose experiences paralleled Emma's own conflict with Jessica Walsh and her allies. But others were popular athletes, honor society members, and social leaders who had witnessed harassment without knowing how to intervene effectively. The diversity of the group revealed that bullying at Riverside High was a community problem rather than an individual issue, affecting students throughout the social hierarchy in ways that traditional administrative responses had failed to address. Emma had prepared remarks about documentation procedures and reporting protocols. But the actual meeting evolved into something far more comprehensive and emotionally significant. Students shared stories that revealed years of systematic harassment, institutional failure, and social isolation that had created a culture of fear and silence throughout the school. More importantly, they began developing strategies that went beyond traditional victim support to address the root causes of harassment and bullying. The coalition would provide documentation assistance and emotional support for individual victims, but it would also work to change social dynamics that enabled harassment and encouraged bystander complicity. The meeting lasted 4 hours and ended with commitments from every attendee to recruit additional members and begin implementing immediate interventions in situations they observed throughout the school. Emma left the library with a sense of purpose and community that she had never experienced during her military childhood or her isolated months at Riverside High. But she also understood that creating the coalition was easier than maintaining it, and that the real test of their organization would come when they faced opposition from students, families, and administrators who benefited from existing power structures. That opposition materialized sooner than Emma had anticipated, in the form of threats and harassment directed not just at her, but at other coalition members, who had made themselves visible targets by association with the organization. The methods were familiar from Jessica Walsh's campaign, but the scope was broader, and the coordination more sophisticated. Emma realized that her victory over Jessica had been just the beginning of a larger conflict with systemic problems that extended far beyond individual bullies or isolated incidents of harassment. The Student Safety Coalition was challenging fundamental assumptions about power, privilege, and accountability that had shaped Riverside High's culture for decades. But Emma Rodriguez had learned something important during her months of enduring harassment and her moment of decisive action in the locker room. She had discovered that moral courage was not a single act of heroism, but a sustained commitment to doing what was right despite personal cost or social pressure. The coalition would face challenges that tested their resolve and threatened their safety, but Emma was no longer the isolated victim who had walked through Riverside High's doors 8 months earlier. She was part of a community of students who had found strength in solidarity and purpose in protection of others. The quiet girl who had once tried so hard to remain invisible had become the leader of a movement that would transform not just Riverside High, but serve as a model for student-led anti-bullying efforts throughout the region. Her legacy would be measured not in personal victories, but in the safety and dignity she had helped create for countless other students who deserved better than the culture of fear and silence they had inherited. Emma Rodriguez had answered a call to leadership that she had never expected to receive, and her response would create ripples of positive change that extended far beyond anything she could have imagined during those dark months when harassment had threatened to destroy her future and her sense of self-worth. 2 years later, Emma Rodriguez stood before the Oregon State Education Board in a conference room that held more political power and administrative authority than she had ever imagined she would address. The marble floors and mahogany paneling suggested institutional permanence, but Emma had learned that institutions were only as strong as the people willing to hold them accountable for their stated values and moral obligations. The invitation to testify had arrived 3 weeks earlier, delivered by a state official whose investigation into bullying prevention programs had identified the Riverside Student Safety Coalition as a model worth replicating throughout Oregon's public school system. What had begun as a desperate attempt to protect herself and a handful of vulnerable classmates had evolved into a statewide initiative that was changing how educational administrators approached student safety and harassment prevention. Emma wore the same simple black dress she had chosen for her high school graduation, but her presence in the room carried authority that had nothing to do with formal attire or official credentials. She possessed something far more valuable than political connections or bureaucratic expertise. She had credible experience with both the failures of traditional anti-bullying approaches and the practical success of student-led alternatives that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. The board members who faced Emma across the polished conference table represented decades of educational administration and policy development, but none of them had successfully solved the harassment problems that plagued schools throughout their districts. Their interest in Emma's testimony reflected both genuine concern for student welfare and professional frustration, with approaches that sounded impressive in policy documents but failed to create meaningful change in actual school environments. "Miss Rodriguez," began Dr. Patricia Hammond, the board chairwoman whose reputation for educational innovation had made her a respected voice in state politics, "we've reviewed the documentation your coalition has compiled over the past 2 years. The statistics are remarkable, but we're particularly interested in understanding the practical methods that produced such dramatic improvements in student safety and institutional accountability." Emma had prepared for this moment by reviewing not just her own experiences, but the stories of dozens of students whose lives had been changed by the coalition's intervention and support. The numbers were indeed impressive, with harassment incidents at Riverside High dropping by 73%, and student confidence in administrative responsiveness increasing by over 200%. But the real measure of success was in individual stories of transformation and empowerment. "Dr. Hammond," Emma began, her voice carrying the calm confidence that had developed through countless presentations to school boards, parent groups, and student organizations throughout the region, "traditional anti-bullying programs fail because they focus on changing individual behavior without addressing the systemic conditions that enable harassment to flourish. Our approach recognizes that bullying is fundamentally a community problem that requires community solutions." She opened the folder she had carried into the hearing and began distributing documents that outlined the coalition's methodology but, more importantly, demonstrated the measurable outcomes their approach had achieved across multiple schools and diverse student populations. "The coalition operates on 3 core principles," Emma continued, noting the attention her words were receiving from board members who had clearly grown accustomed to hearing theoretical discussions rather than practical implementations. "First, students are the most reliable witnesses to harassment because they observe peer interactions that adults rarely see. Second, victims require both immediate support and long-term empowerment rather than just administrative intervention. Third, bystanders must be equipped with practical tools for safe intervention rather than just moral encouragement to speak up." Board member Dr. James Peterson leaned forward with the expression of someone who had spent years searching for approaches that actually worked rather than just sounding politically appropriate. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, his tone suggesting genuine interest in her perspective, "how do you address the concern that student-led initiatives might escalate conflicts rather than resolving them peacefully?" Emma had anticipated this question because it reflected the fundamental misunderstanding that had prevented most adults from recognizing the coalition's potential when it was first proposed. She pulled out her phone and displayed a graph that tracked both harassment incidents and disciplinary actions at Riverside High over a 3-year period. "Dr. Peterson," Emma replied, her response supported by data that made her argument undeniable, "the coalition has actually reduced both harassment incidents and violent confrontations because our approach focuses on early intervention and peer mediation rather than punishment after harm has already occurred. Students trust other students more than they trust adults, and they're more likely to seek help when that help comes from peers who understand their social environment." The graph she displayed showed a clear correlation between coalition activities and decreased violence, but more importantly, it demonstrated increased reporting of incidents during early stages when intervention was most effective and least disruptive to the educational environment. "Our members receive training in conflict de-escalation, documentation procedures, and when to involve adult authorities," Emma continued, addressing the concern that student involvement might exceed appropriate boundaries or create liability issues for school districts. "We complement rather than replace official reporting channels, and we've actually improved administrative effectiveness by providing better information and earlier notification of developing problems." Dr. Hammond studied the documentation with the careful attention of someone who had seen too many promising programs fail due to poor implementation or inadequate oversight. "Miss Rodriguez," she said, her voice carrying both admiration and caution, "the results you've achieved are impressive, but scaling this approach to hundreds of schools across diverse communities will require resources and training that may not be readily available." Emma nodded, recognizing the practical challenges while maintaining confidence in the coalition's adaptability and effectiveness. "Dr. Hammond," she replied, "the coalition model is designed to work within existing resources because it leverages student capabilities that are available in every school. The training programs we've developed can be implemented by school counselors, social workers, or even volunteer community members with appropriate supervision. She distributed additional documents that outlined training protocols, implementation timelines, and support systems that had been tested across different school districts and refined based on feedback from students, administrators, and parents. The materials reflected 2 years of continuous improvement and adaptation, but they maintained focus on core principles that had proven effective regardless of local variations in resources or demographics. The hearing continued for nearly 3 hours, covering everything from legal liability concerns to funding mechanisms for statewide implementation. Emma answered each question with the combination of practical experience and policy understanding that had made her a sought-after speaker at educational conferences throughout the Pacific Northwest. But the most powerful moment came when Dr. Hammond asked Emma to describe what her own experience had taught her about the relationship between individual courage and systemic change. "Dr. Hammond," Emma said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom despite her 18 years, "I learned that institutional change happens when individuals refuse to accept that harmful conditions are inevitable or unchangeable. My confrontation with Jessica Walsh was necessary for my personal safety, but it was meaningless for broader student welfare until it became part of a sustained effort to address the conditions that had enabled her harassment campaign." She paused, gathering her thoughts while considering how to articulate concepts that had taken her months to understand fully and years to implement effectively. "Individual acts of courage matter," Emma continued, "but they become transformative only when they inspire collective action and sustained commitment to values that extend beyond personal benefit. The coalition succeeded because we recognized that everyone's safety depends on everyone else's willingness to intervene when intervention becomes necessary." The board members exchanged glances that suggested Emma's testimony had provided insights they hadn't expected from someone who had only recently graduated from high school. Her perspective combined grassroots experience with policy sophistication in ways that academic research and administrative theory often failed to achieve. "Miss Rodriguez," Dr. Peterson said, his tone carrying the respect that educational professionals reserved for individuals who had achieved measurable success in areas where others had struggled, "We'd like to discuss the possibility of your continued involvement in developing statewide implementation guidelines for student safety coalitions." Emma felt a familiar tension between personal ambition and public service, recognizing that accepting such involvement would delay her college plans while committing her to responsibilities that extended far beyond her original intention of simply protecting herself and her immediate classmates. "Dr. Peterson," she replied carefully, "I'm honored by your interest, but I think the coalition's strength comes from its student leadership rather than adult oversight. The most valuable contribution I can make is helping train student organizers who will adapt our methods to their specific school environments and community needs." The response clearly wasn't what the board members had expected, but Emma understood something about leadership that her formal education had never taught. Effective change required development of local capacity rather than dependence on charismatic individuals, and sustainable programs needed to function independently of their founders' continued involvement. The hearing concluded with commitments from the State Education Board to fund pilot programs in 20 school districts, provide training resources for student organizers, and develop policy guidelines that would support rather than restrict student-led safety initiatives. Emma left the conference room with assurances that her coalition model would reach thousands of students throughout Oregon, but, more importantly, with confidence that the changes she had helped initiate would continue growing and improving long after her personal involvement ended. 6 months later, Emma stood in her dormitory room at Stanford University, packing books and preparing for final exams that would complete her freshman year of college. The walls were decorated with photos from coalition activities, letters from students whose lives had been changed by peer support programs, and newspaper articles documenting the expansion of student safety initiatives throughout the Pacific Northwest. Her phone buzzed with a text message from David Chen, who had assumed leadership of the Riverside Coalition when Emma departed for California. The message contained a photo of 30 students gathered in the same library community room where the original coalition had held its first meeting. But these were new faces representing a new generation of student advocates who had never known the fear and isolation that had once characterized Riverside High. "Monthly meeting just ended," David's message read. "0 harassment incidents reported this month, and Lincoln Middle School wants us to help them start their own coalition. Your training protocols are working perfectly, and everyone wanted me to tell you that your legacy is in good hands." Emma smiled as she processed the implications of David's message. The coalition had become self-sustaining, growing and adapting without requiring her direct involvement or guidance. More importantly, the principles and methods she had helped develop were spreading to younger students who would never experience the kind of systematic harassment that had once seemed inevitable and unchangeable. She thought about Jessica Walsh, who had completed her senior year at a private academy across the state and was reportedly thriving in a university environment that provided structure and support for her academic abilities, while separating her from the social dynamics that had enabled her worst impulses. Emma felt no satisfaction in Jessica's exile, only hope that distance and perspective had helped her former tormentor develop empathy and wisdom that might prevent similar behavior in the future. The real measure of success wasn't Jessica's punishment, but the safety and dignity that current Riverside High students enjoyed because someone had been willing to stand up when standing up became necessary. Emma had learned that true victory came not from defeating enemies, but from creating conditions where enmity became unnecessary and cooperation became natural. Her phone rang with a call from her father, who was finally returning from his deployment overseas and preparing to reunite with his family after 18 months of separation. The timing seemed symbolic, as if her personal growth and family healing were connected to the broader changes she had helped create in her school and community. Mija, her father's voice carried pride mixed with amazement as he processed updates about her college success and continued advocacy work. Your grandmother tells me you've become a leader who changes institutions rather than just surviving them. That's the kind of strength I hoped my training would help you develop. Emma felt tears gathering as she recognized the accuracy of her father's assessment. She had indeed transformed from someone who endured harmful conditions to someone who created better conditions for others facing similar challenges. The martial arts skills he had taught her had been necessary for personal protection, but the leadership capabilities she had developed were proving valuable for community transformation. The conversation continued for an hour, covering everything from academic achievements to family reunion plans, but the core message was clear. Emma Rodriguez had become someone who used her advantages and capabilities, not just for personal benefit, but for the welfare of others who lacked similar resources and protection. As she prepared for sleep that night, Emma reflected on the journey that had begun with Jessica Walsh's harassment campaign and evolved into a statewide movement for student empowerment and institutional accountability. The quiet girl who had once tried so desperately to remain invisible had discovered that some people are called to be visible, to serve as examples and advocates for others who face similar struggles. Emma Rodriguez had answered that call with courage, wisdom, and sustained commitment to values that extended far beyond her personal interests. Her legacy would be measured not in personal achievements, but in the safety, dignity, and empowerment she had helped create for countless students who deserved better than the culture of fear and silence they had inherited. The ripples of change she had initiated would continue spreading long after her own story ended, touching lives and transforming communities in ways she could never fully know or appreciate. Sometimes the greatest victories are achieved not through single acts of heroism, but through sustained dedication to creating a world where heroism becomes unnecessary because justice and compassion have become normal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.